Hello, friends. Welcome to the Mongolian Adventures Podcast, a place for stories about Mongolia for adventurous kids. Get comfortable, snuggle in, and let's begin.
Let's begin.
The air tasted of dirt, and Minjin closed her eyes as she felt the sand-filled wind whip past her nose and whiskers. Her fur felt heavy with the grains that had settled there over the course of their travel day. The sun was setting out in front of the microbus, just barely visible from the under compartment where the mice rode, the humans above. She wondered how they felt about the dirt and dust, the sand finding its way to their hair, the corners of their eyes, and their fingernails. The Gobi Desert tasted gritty, the texture rough, the wind smooth around them. She soaked in the cool breeze, wondering how much longer they had to go. Minjin hadn't intended to head this direction, but the mouse sitting next to her had changed all of the non-plans she had had. Could you say plans had changed if there hadn't been a change to begin with? She laughed to herself, tracing the lines of her adventures in her memories. Here she was, a mouse from Narantol, in the biggest, loudest city of Mongolia, flying through the roads of the Gobi, sand caked in between her toes. Saying yes to strangers turned acquaintances who invited her on research expeditions. Reminded of their goals, Minjin glanced over at Handa, who was scribbling notes on her journal, performing math calculations in the margins of her paper, hastily fixing her mistakes as she braced herself from the bumps of the micro. Smiling to herself, Minjin wondered where this new travel partner would lead her next. But for now, hopefully, a night of sleep near the sand dunes where they were headed. Everyone pictured the sand dunes of the Gobi Desert. They were an infamous image of Mongolia, the place mice and humans around the world pictured when they thought of this country and its land. Minjin had seen the pictures in her own school lessons, tucking them away as one part of her country and history. She hadn't imagined she would get to visit them, but here she was, excited to experience this important part of Mongolian geography. "Hongri Nils! Hongri Nils!" the ticket taker at the front of the seats shouted, his voice rolling over the rows of mice, startling some awake and interrupting conversations mid-sentence. Handa glanced up, paused her pencil, and began to tuck her notebook back into her bag. "That will be us," she said to Minjin. "Time to make our way to the dunes." "You mean we won't be there when they drop us off?" Minjin asked, turning to the ecologist, disheveled in her khaki shirt and shorts, almost a camouflage against her soft brown fur. Glasses slipped down her nose as she looked at Minjin. "Oh dear, haven't you learned that transportation in Mongolia doesn't ever drop us off at the spot you want to go?" Handa chuckled a bit as she said it, her face a wide smile. Minjin grinned back, thinking of her own adventures hiking from bus stops and taxi drop-offs to her actual destinations. "Well, now that you say it," she said, "I suppose the drop-off is just the start of the search." And with that, the microbus lurched to a stop, and Handa stood, motioning for Minjin to follow as they grabbed their bags, secured them on their backs, and jumped off into the sandy patch of land waiting on the side of the road. Now what? Minjin looked to Handa as they stood on the side of the road, the bus trundling off into the distance, and the sun beginning to fade into a whisper around them. "And now we look for the path," she said with confidence, marching towards the grassy sand to their right. Minjin took a breath and followed, breathing in the scent of dirt and sand. She could hear the movement alongside them and wondered what animals were waiting for them there. 3 hours later, Minjin wondered if she could suggest they might be lost. They had walked in quiet for the last hour. Both she and Handa were too tired to make conversation. The walk had turned into a hike as they had navigated up and down and around piles of sand and grass and rocks that led them around and down, a roller coaster of a path that still didn't show them an end. It was pitch dark, and large winged insects fluttered through the sky, crickets croaking at them as they passed, creeping through the sand. Minjin thought she might be scared, but she also was so exhausted she could barely keep her eyes open. Her head dipped down forward, and the dirt touching her whiskers jolted her awake again, the scenery before her blurring. All of a sudden they saw a light bumping towards them from the path they had come from, the road. "Hey! Hey!" shouted Handa, waving her mouse arms as the light came closer, jumping up and down to be seen. Minjin pulled herself up and joined her. "Over here!" she shouted, her body filled with adrenaline and energy. A small mouse jeep pulled next to them, revealing 2 mice wearing cowboy hats sitting in the front. "Well, hello," the driver said. "I'm Nico, and this is Ushu. Are you lost?" "Not lost," Handa said, but sorely underestimated how long it would take for us to walk from the bus stop to the dunes. "Oh, no way, not in the dark," said Nico. "That's at least a 2-day journey by foot, and it's hard to find the path without the sun. Jump in and I'll give you a ride. I run a camp here and can take you right up to the dunes." Minjin heaved a sigh of relief as they climbed into the jeep and sat down, her feet saying thank you in aching gratitude. She really did need to find some proper hiking boots. Handa chatted with Nico and Ushu as they bounced their way through the path, moving at a speed that would have taken them hours on foot. "So you live here full time?" she asked, already reaching for her pencil and paper, tucked in the front pocket of her bag. "That's right, we do," Ushu answered. "We're cousins. We grew up here with our parents and then decided to set up a camp for visitors, just a little ways down the dunes from where we grew up." "Oh, perfect," Handa replied, jotting down notes as she spoke. "So you'll be able to give me lots of great background information on the area." Ushu glanced at Minjin, raising his whiskers in question at Handa's comments. "She's an ecological researcher," Minjin explained, smiling. "We're here to complete some measurements, do research, and otherwise gather information about the dunes and how they are changing over time." "Ah, gotcha," he said, nodding thoughtfully. He pointed ahead to where Minjin could just make out some white in the distance. "We're here. Why don't you all get some sleep and we can talk in the morning?" Minjin could barely reply, her whole body screaming for rest. Nico and Usku showed them to a simple wooden cabin where she and Handa collapsed onto the hard wooden bed frames, not even bothering to change their clothes. She was asleep before she could remember to say goodnight. She heard the whistling before she opened her eyes. "Is that you?" she asked Handa, rolling over with her brain still foggy from sleep. "What?" mumbled Handa from the other bunk. "That noise? I thought it was you." "Nope," Minjin said, managing to sit up and crack open her eyes, shaking the dust out of her ears, eyes, arms, toes. "Weird, it sounds so loud." Minjin started to giggle as Handa pawed for her bag, pulling it close to her and grabbing her notebook even as her eyes were still closed. "You really can take notes while you're asleep?" she asked. Handa started laughing too. "I wish! I would take notes constantly if I could. I don't want to miss anything." "I don't think you're going to miss this. It's the loudest sound I've ever heard." At this, they both collapsed backwards on their beds, laughing until even the dust couldn't stay on their whiskers from how they shook. It was going to be a good day. They discovered the source of the noise as they finally pushed open the cabin's door in search of the outhouse. The wind whipped past them in a fury, knocking them both over onto the porch, where they stood, grabbing onto the wooden posts, gritting at each other with humor. The wind hummed, whistling around them, the sound of a train in its power and invisible form. "I guess we found our whistler," shouted Minjin over the wind. "Wind whistler it is!" yelled Handa back. "We're going to need all of our strength today. Let's get some breakfast and get going." They fought their way to the outhouse, cleaned up, only to be immediately covered in sand as soon as they stepped outside again, had a quick breakfast of cheese and crackers, and used all of their strength to push against the wind and out to the front of the camp. Nico and Ushu were there, repairing a piece of wood that had been ripped off the side of their welcome center. Good morning, they said, shouting over the din of the wind. Morning, Minjin replied. This wind, huh? It's the norm here, but I know it's a surprise for visitors, said Nico. How can we get to the top of the dunes? Handa asked, her notepad already full of her notes from the morning. I've asked my friend Lama to come show you the way, said Usku. She should be here any moment. And with that, a lovely brown mouse came bounding around the corner of the cabin, her body wrapped in ropes, clips, and a bag filled with heavy water bottles that sloshed as she stopped, bracing herself against the wind. Morning! She shouted over the whistling waves, bending them all towards the ground. Who is ready to climb some dunes? Minjin could feel the energy filling her own body and smiled as she saw Handa snap into research mode, her pencil poised, the pages of her notebook fighting to rip off and fly away with the strength of the wind. Let's do this, Minjin replied, and off they went, following Lama into the sand. Minjin had never experienced anything like it. The strength it took to walk against the wind and to walk in the soft sand, which moved after each paw step, sliding away from her so she felt like she was going to topple over. Suddenly, she understood why Lama had ropes wrapped around her. Handa peppered Lama with questions as they made their way to the base of the dunes, looming before them in their large, soft brown stature. Lama patiently answered them, explaining about wind speeds, depth of sands, the way the sands move, and how long she had lived here. At the bottom of the dunes, sand stretched out before them. Lama told them to buckle in. She found anchors buried in the sand and wrapped her ropes around them, clipping them all in with careful paws. The dunes are safe, but always changing, she explained. As mice, we don't have long enough legs to power ourselves up the dunes safely. We leave that to the humans and camels. So we have some of these rope systems for us to use to get to the top more easily and safely. Please follow me as we go up, and then we reach the top. When we reach the top, we can talk. Lama went first, motioning with her arms for Handa to follow, and Minjin to finish up their slow pull to the top. Her arms burned as they pulled the rope, her paws sliding in the smooth sand that seemed to slip away from her the moment she touched it. The wind whipped around her, and she felt her smallness in the world, the sound of the earth and its strength very loud in the dunes and wind around her. You made it! Lama cheered for them as they stood in the sand. The sound of the wind was even stronger at the top. They could barely hear each other talk, shouting over its volume. Even Handa, normally always moving with note-taking, measurements, and observations, stood still. The three of them stood in the sand, looking over at the dunes that stretched before them, a yellow dust of waves continuing on and on into the distance. Do you hear it? Lama asked them quietly, just barely a whisper above the wind. Hear what? Minjin asked, not taking her eyes off of the beauty of the dunes. The sands are singing to you, she replied, her face a gentle smile, closing her eyes. Singing? Minjin replied, the question in her voice. We call the Khongoryn, the singing dunes, because of the sound the sand makes as it moves from the wind. Minjin closed her eyes as well, letting the song of the sand fill her small gray ears. The sands never stop moving, reshaping and forming new waves and piles of sand. The wind blows them, tossing and shifting them, and together this movement makes a song. Lama explained. I like to think of it as the sand dunes talking to us, telling its story, sharing how it's changing, moving, becoming new each day. It reminds me that nature changes and grows just like us mice. At that, Handa sprung into action. I couldn't agree more, she shouted over the wind. That's why we're here, so I can measure and observe and see how the dunes are changing. Then we can better understand what's happening here at the dunes. She gave Minjin and Lama instructions, handing them bags to place sand samples into, ones that Minjin carefully labeled with marker, trying hard not to smear her writing with her paws as she did so. They spent the next 3 hours bustling around the dunes, following Handa's instructions for what to do, how to hold the tape measure, and how to use her various tools. Okay, we can pause, Handa finally said, collapsing down into the sand. We got a lot done. Enough to be done? Minjin asked carefully, uncertain if Handa would ever be satisfied enough to call herself done. Well, we're never done, Handa replied, looking up at the sky. But for 3 mice, with this wind, we've collected some excellent data to use and share with other scientists. Why do you need this data? Lama asked curiously. You are familiar with climate change, yes? Handa replied. It's when the weather of a place used to be one way, but then we see changes in those normal ways over a long period of time. Lama and Minjin nodded, showing they understood. Handa continued. Right now, around the world, we have seen many changes because of climate change. As a scientist, I want to see and track how these changes are happening and think about what we can do. Mongolia is getting warmer and warmer each year. Mining companies are using more and more water. There are more animals eating in the same land. All of these things are changing the land and the natural resources. What's changing here at the dunes? Lama asked, concern in her voice. One thing that we are measuring is the spread of the dunes. Because of the warmer temperatures and weather changes, we've seen that the Gobi Desert is actually getting bigger. The sands are covering more and more of the land. This is called desertification, Handa explained. She sat up and looked around at the dunes. They are beautiful, but if the sand spreads too much, the animals and humans who live here won't have enough land for finding the food and water they need. Minjin thought then of how thirsty she had been all day, of the water bottles they had carried and used as they had worked. There was no water here in these magnificent sands. Why is the water disappearing? She asked Handa. There are a few different reasons, but one of the biggest users of water here in the Gobi is the human mining companies that come to dig up minerals from deep underground. Handa sighed and continued. Their work uses millions of gallons of water each day, water that otherwise would be available for animals and humans to use for their living and growing. Minjin was quiet, thinking of all of that water being used up, taken away from the land. Lama nodded. You're right. We've noticed less water. We've seen how we have to go farther to get the water we need. I don't want to have to leave the sand dunes. They are my home. But I also can't stay here if we eventually run out of water or have to walk for days to find some. The Khongoryn were a place to visit for Minjin, but she could see on Lama's face just how much she loved her home. Handa looked at her with kindness. That's why we do this work, so we can be like the sand dunes, singing the story of what is happening, what is changing, where the sands are moving. We work so that the story of our earth, our land, our water is told. Singing isn't just a beautiful sound, it's storytelling. Minjin closed her eyes again, listening to the wind as it spoke, to the song of the sands, to the story it was telling them. She held it in her heart, and she promised to share it, to tell the story of the Khongoryn. Handa dusted herself off and jumped up, clapping her paws together. Come on, friends, let's get to the bottom and start some measurements of the bottom of the dunes. Lama and Minjin glanced at each other and grinned, shrugging. What could you do? Handa was nothing if not determined. Back to work it was. The song would be there for them to listen to at the bottom, too. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Mongolian Adventures podcast. You can find more information about the podcast, as well as lesson plans for educators, at www.mongolianadventurespodcast.com. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Mongolian Adventures Podcast. And on Twitter, we're at Mongolian ADV Pod. We'd love for you to draw a picture or create artwork based off of today's story. Send us your pictures at mongolian.adventures.podcast@gmail.com, and maybe you'll see it featured on our social media. Until next time.
May your adventures be big and your dreams even bigger.